This is Mike with Matthetai Ministry. I want to welcome you back. Thank you for checking us out. We've been looking at arguments for the existence of God. We've talked about the ontological and the teleological arguments. Today we want to briefly consider the cosmological argument, one of my favorites of the four that we're going to be presenting. And so I wanted to just give you a brief overview of that, and hopefully that helps ground your faith in ration and reason, that we have a reasonable faith behind this here. So a brief look at the history of the cosmological argument. We're going to start with Thomas, St. Thomas Aquinas. This is called the Thomistic version. And he wants to reason from the existence of dependent beings to the existence of an independent being, namely God. Now, as dependent beings, our existence depends on someone else or something else. We are not self-existent. Our existence depends on something else creating us or forming us or causing us to exist. And what Thomas says is that we eventually have to get back to a being who is not dependent. There has to be some independent being or cause at the beginning. Now, if we were to lay it out in a deductive format, premise one would argue and say that there are dependent beings. This is a pretty self-explanatory point. Very few people, if anybody, would ever try to doubt this. There are dependent beings. You and I are dependent. We are not self-existent. Second premise would say if something is a dependent being, then its continued existence must be sustained by something else. It's the very definition of a dependent being, is that if you are dependent for your existence on something else. So your presence and your continued existence is dependent on something causing you to exist. Again, not highly debatable, pretty obvious, pretty self-explanatory. The third premise says if a dependent being is sustained by something else, then either the chain of sustained beings regresses infinitely, or it terminates in an independent being that is not itself sustained. So he says we've got two options here for how we as dependent beings exist. If we are sustained by something else, that something else can either be a previous dependent being, and we can just continue to go back forever and ever with dependent being creating another dependent being to another dependent being, and all the way back into infinity. That's a problem, though. Having an infinite regress, as we call it, is a logical impossibility. And there's a great argument that the impossibility of traversing an actual infinite. So if we have an actual infinite number of beings, we would never be able to go through enough beings to get to where we are today. We'd have to pass through an infinite amount of beings to get to you and I today. So it's logically impossible to have an actual infinite. So we can't have an infinite regress of causes. There has to be some original cause. And he's simply arguing that that independent being has to be self-sustaining, not sustained by something else. And then his fourth premise says that the chain of sustained beings cannot regress infinitely, which we just stated there. And therefore, the conclusion, the chain of sustained beings must terminate in an independent being that is not itself sustained. So that initial being that causes all of the others must itself not be caused or not be sustained by something else. Must be self-existent. So that was Thomas's general argument there, a great foundation for this. Leibniz put his little spin on that several centuries later, and Leibniz proposed it this way. Premise one, he said, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. Now, this is taking it a step further, because what it's saying is that if it exists, there's an explanation for that existence, meaning that even if you are a being that exists necessarily or that is not sustained by something else, you still have an explanation. That explanation might come from yourself, your own self-existence, but it's explained in some ways. And so we know that, God would have a necessary existence from the ontological argument, and therefore his argument clarifies the nature of God as a necessary uncaused being. And so his explanation for existence is inherent in his own character, and it's not sustained or dependent on any other entity outside of himself. And so Leibniz goes back to the explanations there. So his first premise, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. Second premise, if then the universe has one explanation of its existence, then the explanation is God, if God is that first cause. And then he says, premise 3, that the universe exists. one premise that very few of us would ever try to argue. The fourth premise, the universe has an explanation of its existence. It follows from premise 1 that if everything that exists has an explanation, the universe exists, therefore the universe must have an explanation. But he's argued in premise 2 that if there is an explanation, that explanation must be God. And therefore, he concludes the explanation of the universe's existence is God himself. So he's kind of wrapped up the conclusion in his premises, so you can't come to any other conclusion. You could take issue with the second premise there, that if the universe has an explanation, that explanation is God. That's where we would attack Leibniz's form of this argument, because we could come up with other explanations perhaps for the existence of the universe. We certainly have nowadays with the Big Bang Theory, with evolution, with different cosmologies throughout the centuries and millennia. And we can make an argument there is another explanation for the existence of the universe rather than God himself. But Leibniz is simply saying that he's included in the premise that God has to be that explanation. So most would take exception with premise number 2, that God has to be that explanation, and they could definitely argue for that. And so the best form of this argument, I would say, is not a Christian argument, but it actually comes from a Muslim scholar. Al-Ghazali was a 12th century Muslim theologian from Persia. And he was influenced by Greek philosophy, picked up on this cosmological argument, and created his own form that we know today as the Kalam Cosmological Argument. And so he is proposing that the universe flows necessarily out of God and is beginningless, while God himself is eternal. And so he's got a great perspective on this, and probably the most prominent perspective that we see today, one of the more powerful forms of this argument that we see today. But it's a very simple 3-step argument we're going to see here. Premise 1 simply states that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now that's important because we can't come from nothing. If you have a beginning, then you've come from something. So the entire universe, even if we look at modern scientific theory of the Big Bang cosmology and the explosion of that infinite particle into all that we know today, there's still something. We've come from something. And so you can't come from nothing if you have a beginning of your existence. And he argues in that second premise, so first premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Second premise, the universe began to exist. And the third premise, therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, he's not defined what that cause is yet. We can still get to other premises that will lead to further argumentation for what the cause of the universe is. But let's look at these premises first. So in that first one, we can't come from nothing. We must come from something. All science, when it talks about the production of material, the Big Bang cosmology, any sort of scientific explanation starts with something that interacts and reacts in a certain way to produce something else. So we always start with something. We never start with nothing. And if something comes from nothing, why can't everything come from nothing? Why can't we have just one moment where something comes from nothing, and yet no other moment following that where something comes from nothing? We always have genesis from something, and so therefore we've got some big struggles with that. Now, we all might ask this question, what about God? Does God have a cause in that sense? Well, there's where his premise 1, the way it's worded, solves that dilemma right away. It says whatever begins to exist has a cause. We would have to argue now that God, by definition, is eternal with no beginning. So God does not require a cause since he has no beginning. And so that's how we would get around that in this premise 1. And then looking at the second premise, he says the universe began to exist. Now, this is not much of a debate today. Nobody, or very few people today, would argue that the universe has simply always been around. It's not logically sound for the impossibility of traversing an actual infinite that we talked about a few minutes ago. And you know, we can't count. Another way to look at the actual infinite there is if you were to go into a library and you have an infinite amount of books on the shelf, and you want to get up to a certain book at a certain point, you would have to go read an infinite amount of pages in an infinite amount of volumes to get to that book. And you would never be able to read enough to get through that infinite to get to the place you want to be. So time-wise, if there's an infinite amount of time before us, we would not be able to traverse or go across all of that time span to get to where we are today. We'd always have an infinite amount of time to go to get to today. And so today would never arrive. Now, logically speaking, we cannot pass or traverse an actual infinite. We can't go through that. And so if the universe has to have begun to exist, there's also scientific evidences for this. Big Bang cosmology has shown that the universe is a certain amount of time old, which will be a whole nother discussion in there. But not even modern science holds that the universe is eternal, that there is a starting point. If the universe were eternal, we would be at some point today, we would be at a cold, lifeless state because of the expansion of the universe. Even with the expansion and contraction, we've got a lot of scientific difficulties and problems in there. So the origin, the beginning of the universe, is a scientific principle. It's a philosophical principle. So both of these are fairly well supported by both of those disciplines. And so the beginning of time itself, we have to arrive at a point where, all of the distance between the galaxies is zero if we're talking about this Big Bang cosmology. And at some point, those galaxies would have to shrink back and shrink back into that infinitely dense point, which Big Bang talks about. And all matter and time and space and all that stuff would have to come forth from that. So we can't have these things existing forever. It's just not possible. We're coming out of something. Now, the second law of thermodynamics is another point of that. Unless energy is being fed into a system, that system will become increasingly disorderly. And so the future of our universe is very grim if this is the case, because we are breaking down, and we're going to become a cold, lifeless universe in the near future if this is true. We've also got a couple other attempts to answer the idea that the universe had a beginning. Some have said there's an oscillating universe that expands and then contracts. But, there's no real evidence for this to be seen. We've got various theories about black holes and different things trying to explain this away, but it doesn't fit the models. There's no real evidence for it. It's just a theory out there that could supposedly give us some answers, but it doesn't really satisfy that. And then finally, the more modern day popular viewpoint is either bubble universes or the multiverse, that we've got multiple versions of this universe. And maybe there are some universes out there with different laws present, different logic present. It's hard to imagine some of those. But the idea behind that is you would still need an origin to the multiverses. When did these start? We can't have an infinite regression at that point. So at some point, we have to get back to a beginning. So the universe, in whatever form it takes, whatever perception we have of the universe, has to have an origin. And that origin has to be an uncaused, it has to be an infinite origin that does not have a cause for itself, does not have a beginning of its existence. Otherwise, we have to explain that as well. And so we can look at a little bit about the nature and character of this being that created the universe, and a couple things that we can conclude from that. One, as we've been arguing here, is that this being has to be beginningless. Whatever has caused this universe, now I'm going to say being because we'll talk about personal traits in just a moment, this entity has to have no beginning itself, so it has to be eternal. So if God is the origin of the universe, God must be eternal, not be caused, and have no beginning himself. He's not dependent on any others for his existence, and therefore that would be one of the character traits or attributes of God from this argument. A second thing that this beginning would have to be is transcendent. This would have to be outside of the universe itself, outside of time, space, and matter, which means this is timeless and spaceless or massless. This being cannot be limited to our time frame because time didn't exist prior to the beginning of the universe, nor did matter or space. So the cause of the universe would have to be outside or transcendent of these things. So if God is the cause of the universe, God is beginningless, God is uncaused or eternal, and God is transcendent beyond time, space, and matter. And so he's outside of all of those things, and that's exactly what we see the Christian God as. We would also have to see that this cause of the universe is extremely powerful. When we look at this universe, when we look at the force that it took to bring this into motion, that force is extremely powerful, something more than we've ever seen. Even in Big Bang cosmology, the explosion of that infinitely dense particle was such a forceful explosion to create all of these things that it's one that we can't duplicate or we can't describe because our laws don't effectively describe it. And so this being or this cause of the universe has to be extremely powerful to bring all of this about. So we have a beginningless, timeless, massless, spaceless, extremely powerful origin to the universe. Now let's also talk about intellect. Look at the order and the design, going back to the teleological argument that we've talked about. Look at the fine-tuning of this universe, the specifications of all of the things within this universe, the specificity of the atmosphere and the atomic nature and the interactions and so on and so forth. All of these things are mind-boggling to us. And yet these were brought into existence by whatever brought this universe about. And we could either label that to a just blind chance, but again, we still can't explain how these things got here, or we can say that there is a beginningless, spaceless, timeless, massless, powerful, intelligent cause, which we're describing God now at this point. And then finally, one thing that might be another step in a little bit of a reach here, but I'm willing to take this step, is that this cause is personal. In order to bring about rational minds, you have to be a rational mind yourself. And so only a mind fits this description, a mind with intellect, a mind with intention and purpose, again, the teleological argument, a mind that seeks relationship, a mind that seeks to have reflection of itself in creation. And so for us as rational beings, we are brought about by a rational being itself. And so we have a God here who brings about an effect. The effect brought about must be present in the cause itself too. And so we have to have, in order for us to have this rationale, our cause must have rationale always there. And so God is, I would argue one last step here before we sign off, is that God is triune as well. Now, we're going to reach into scripture for this one. God is love, 1 John 4 tells us. And that love takes as the object of its affection something outside of itself. Now, if God is all that existed prior to the creation of this universe, all you have is God. Who does God love? God can't love himself. That's self-love. That's narcissism. There's a measure of self-appreciation in love, but genuine love, the love that we would define as genuine love, certainly scriptural love, takes an object outside of itself and puts its affection there. And so prior to the creation of this universe, we have a beginningless, eternal, transcendent, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, non-physical, powerful, intelligent, personal creator that is a creator with the character of love. And with that character of love, we have to have an object outside. So God must exist in at least two parts, and I would argue three, that you have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The Father loves the Son loves the Spirit loves the Father, and vice versa. They all love each other perfectly. And so as the Father loves the Son, loves the Spirit, he's demonstrating perfect love prior to the creation of anything else. And then as you and I come along, he now transfers that love or expands that love, even better, to include us as objects of his affection. And so this argument seems to be one of the most strongest arguments that we get to the cause of the universe is something that begins. And since God has no beginning, we need no definition for him. We need no explanation for him. When people ask that question, well, what caused God? That's an illogical question. It would be like asking, what color is square? Because the two are mutually exclusive. God, by definition, is beginningless. He is causeless. There is no cause. There is no origin. So when we ask for the origin of the one with no origin, it's an illogical question. And so we're violating the laws of logic by asking that question. So I hope the Kalam Cosmological Argument gives you some foundation for our belief in God. And as we start putting these arguments together, we've looked at that ontological argument where God is a necessary being simply by a priori rationale. Just by using our rationale alone, we conclude that God must necessarily exist. And then last time we looked at the teleological argument, looking at the fine-tuning of our universe. It is so finely tuned that there seems to be a purpose that it was designed for. And where there's a purpose, there is someone to give that purpose. And so something must be behind this argument that makes this universe exist. And then with the Kalam Cosmological Argument, if this universe had a beginning, which we've concluded today scientifically and philosophically, then that beginning must have a cause. And so whatever begins to exist has a cause. God doesn't begin to exist, so he doesn't need a cause, but this universe does. Therefore, the cause of this universe is God himself. And we see a bit about the character that we would expect to find in God. And we see that exactly demonstrated in Scripture. So hopefully with these arguments, we've got a pretty good foundation for our understanding of the existence of God. We're going to take 2 more videos coming up. We're going to look at the moral argument, and then we're going to examine an argument against the existence of God, the problem of evil, and see what those have to say. So I hope you're liking these videos. Subscribe to the channel, hit that notification button up there. Make sure to check out our website, mathati.org, for more information about the ministry and what's going on here. Find us on Facebook and Instagram. We'd love to catch up with you, and we'll look forward to seeing you guys real soon.